Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Makeshift Madness. I'm Jim Ballou, and in this episode we're going to be talking about ways to drill holes in things. So let's get started. At any remote campsite or deep in the wilderness, chances are we won't have access to electric drills. Definitely not shop drill presses, and probably even battery-powered drills won't be all that practical either. So we might have to rely on manually powered systems. And yet, we could easily encounter numerous instances where we would want to drill or punch a hole through something. Maybe you just need to drill holes in a stick that you can feed your line through to your tent stake, and you can create a tensioner for the guideline for your tent, which is adjustable tension-wise. Or drill a hole through a deer antler for a primitive arrow straightening wrench in the wilderness. Or maybe you want to bore a hole into the end of a stick. Nice deep hole, create a container for small items like fish hooks, maybe matches, sewing needles, what have you. And you could create a stopper for the end, and using your drilling capability, you might just also want to drill holes for lanyard cord in the plug and in the body of the container. Well, maybe you want to create a little camp table out of a half log, and you want it to have some legs, and you've got some branches, but you need to affix them or insert them into the base. You might need to drill some holes. And even the simple task of putting an extra hole in your belt represents the need for putting a hole into something. I think having the capability to bore holes is too often overlooked in the usual process of selecting tools for the outdoors, which invariably focuses mostly on blades, axes, fire-making tools, and saws. But right now in this video, we are going to talk about some of the options available to us for when we need to put holes in things in the field. And all of one variation or another is the most rudimentary of all hole-producing tools. Awls can be used to bore through such materials as leather, rawhide, softwood, bone, plastic, tree bark, heavy canvas, thin metal, clay, and possibly numerous other materials. Dave Canterbury talks quite a bit about the usefulness of awls in several of his bushcraft videos. There are different types of awls for different purposes, but I think it is worth noting that a triangular shaped awl, or even one with a square tapered tip, will pierce materials much easier than will a pointed tapered round bar. This is why most of the needles used for leather stitching are triangular rather than round like most other sewing needles. Awls can be made quite easily in several different ways. Probably the easiest and fastest way to make an awl is to simply grind it out of a small screwdriver, like this, or like this. And you can protect the tip with a cork and keep it in your sewing kit. If you were to hammer forge an awl out of square stock like this, now you've got a handle with which to grip the awl. Plus, in a pinch, if you needed, you could drive this into the side of a tree around your camp, and now you've got a hook with which to hang your gear by. And you can use the reamer awl on your Swiss Army knife to bore holes. Get your hole started and just keep working it. And the Swiss Army knife can bore holes for you. The brace and bit represents a very traditional system for manually boring holes in lumber, used for centuries by carpenters and woodworkers. These basic tools can still be found newly made, available through the internet or through woodworking catalogs, but newly made, they can be relatively expensive. However, They are commonly found used at garage sales and at flea markets, and prices will typically be in the $5 to $15 range, based on my experience anyway. I would recommend looking them over carefully before buying used ones, especially at the chuck, because I've seen a lot of them that were missing one or both of their jaws, and also sometimes the ratchets won't work properly. The brace tends to be faster to drill with than any T-handle type drill, but they're also bigger and heavier, so definitely not as practical for storing in a backpack or in a camp bag. Nevertheless, combined with a set of suitable auger wood bits, the brace could be a super handy tool around a homestead, and especially for off-grid living, where electricity might not be available for power tools. This homemade wooden T-handle drill is probably not the most practical idea I ever came up with, but it was created mainly as an experiment. I was trying to come up with some way a person could potentially create a functional handle for a small drill bit in a remote environment, and maybe without access to a supply of scrap metal to build with. In this case, I used hardwood dowels to form the cross-shaped handle. The cross pieces were notched and fit together, then glued and tightly lashed with strong, small diameter cord. The shank of the twist drill bit was notched and then inserted into a hole the same diameter, drilled into the end of the longer dowel, and epoxy was used to help hold it firmly into position. I suspect this could be the weak point of this system. I put it together years ago, and as far as I can remember, never got around to putting it to the test. But right now I'm really curious as to whether or not this little gadget would actually drill a hole into anything like wood, or whether it will simply come apart under the stress of torque. I say we find out right now. This is a piece of hardwood of some kind. I don't know exactly what kind of wood, but we're going to try to make a hole into it. Yeah, it hasn't broken yet. We got a pretty good start. It's coming through. Well, I'm actually surprised it didn't break. And we can fit a cork on it to protect the tip for our kit. Here's another approach for creating a lightweight drill with a fixed T-handle. In this case, I found a broken steel nipple wrench intended for changing out the cap nipples on a percussion black powder firearm. And it already had its own little T-handle, but half of the section that fits over the base of the nipples was broken off. I ground that flush. Since it already had a hole into that end of the main shaft, I was able to shape the end of the shank on a 1/4-inch diameter auger wood bit to fit into it, and then I brazed the seam for a permanent connection. This would be a more durable T-handle hand drill than the previous example, yet still lightweight enough to be a practical tool for keeping in a backpack. I remember when I first saw these advertised on the internet. I think it was called a settler's tool or settler's wrench, and what it is an auger bit for boring into wood with a piece of tubing welded to the shank of the bit and perpendicular, and the whole idea is you would fit a stick into it and form a T-handle, and you could really get some serious pressure on there to bore your hole. And what was neat about this particular model is that it has kind of a sharp ring on it here, and if you needed a peg the same size as your drill bit, you could fit that on the end of a stick and you could baton it, and it would trim it away and form a peg that would fit whatever hole you made with your drill bit. So it was a really neat little tool. I thought it was a really neat idea, and it came in its own little pouch with a belt loop, and what a handy little boring tool. Became really popular with bushcrafters. And I learned that this type of configuration with a ring or a tube welded to the end of an auger bit to facilitate forming an expedient T-handle is most commonly called a Scottish eye. As I started noticing YouTubers using these in their bushcraft videos, I finally decided to build my own version of it. And on several websites, I saw where people were making removable Scottish eyes, so you could have one eye for multiple bit sizes, and I like that idea. And so I found videos on Dave Canterbury has a video on this. Corporal's Corner has a video on this, and they have different ideas about it. I think it was Corporal's Corner that used the idea of a socket and attaching it to your eye. In my case, I decided to use a pipe coupling, threaded pipe coupling, and instead of just doing a butt weld to the eye, I decided to braze it. And what I did was I drilled a hole into the body of the coupling and fit this in, hammered it in actually, so it fit really tight. And then I brazed it on because I don't trust my butt welds. I've done a lot of butt welds that looked really good and then they broke. But with a flux-coated braze rod, and especially using an oxyacetylene torch adjusted for a neutral flame, the task of brazing is super easy and for me a lot of fun. It's 11/32 actually is what it is. And this fits onto the shank of 3 different bit sizes: 1 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1/2 inch. A quick note about brazing versus welding. On occasion, I'll experiment with different types of welding. Certainly, every welding method has its own suitable applications. Brazing is actually more closely related to soldering than to any method of welding, because with brazing, the base metals and the filler metal are not actually fused together like they are in welding, but instead, molten braze is added as like a glue that sticks to the base metals to join them together. Given the nature of this process, one might be inclined to believe that welds should form much stronger bonds than brazed connections, but this is not necessarily the case. Brazed connections can be incredibly strong and possibly stronger than a lot of welds. In Richard Finch's Welder's Handbook, he explains it like this. Most people think that brazing isn't as strong as welding because they've seen or heard of braze joints breaking. To disprove this, compare the tensile strengths of welding and brazing rods. E7018 is considered to be the best arc welding rod, and it has a 70,000 psi tensile strength. Now look at the tensile strength of several brazing rods on page 139, 80,000 psi or more. Very small projects can sometimes even be brazed using just a $50 MAP gas torch, as long as the base metals can be heated to a bright orange glow, which isn't always easy with just a MAP gas torch. And back now again to this handy removable Scottish eye. The way I have it is you can just thread pipe nipples into it, and I cut the threaded part off of each end of these parts for my kit. And if I don't want to use a stick to put through my Scottish eye, I can thread these into it, and then I have a really secure way to turn my drill bit. This is a really neat idea that I've seen 2 different versions of on the internet, and so I decided to create my own version of it. Both examples I saw showed it as a homemade T-handle tap holder for cutting threads inside a hole, like this. I decided to take the basic concept and use it as a T-handle drill bit holder for boring holes by hand. The beauty of this little device is that it is made of just an extension nut and 2 eye bolts, found in almost every hardware store, with a 5/16 inch diameter hole drilled into one side of the extension nut to receive the shake of your drill bit, or a threading tap, whichever you prefer. In the first video I saw with it, The guy had simply cut a square notch into one side large enough to receive the shank of the tap. I didn't like this idea because it looks to me like it would weaken the body of it, as only the thin backside would be holding the two ends together where the bolts screw in to clamp the cutter into position. In the second example, a hole was drilled into one side just like this to receive the shank of the cutter, but in that one, he used regular bolts to tighten onto the tap and to form the T-handle. I prefer using eye bolts instead because they are easier to turn by hand, plus more suitable for stringing onto a cord for keeping everything together in your kit. You'd want bits with flats on their shanks rather than round for this to work properly. But nowadays, with so many cordless drills and screwdrivers in use, bits with flats on their shanks are super common. But this thing does work really well. A pin vise is a handy little tool for drilling small holes. It's usually just a chuck with a handle on the end, and pin vices come in different sizes, different models, different manufacturers, but basically you can fit a small twist drill into it, or you can use it for other things too, sewing needles, whatever. And if you just need to drill a hole by hand, represents another way to bore holes. Bushcrafters are all familiar with the bow drill system, as it's a popular method for creating fire with friction, using a pointed stick and a fireboard. But an adaptation of this method was once a common system for drilling small holes through bone, wood, and even iron, with the appropriate bit attached. So you have the bow, the cord that wraps around the spindle with some type of bit attached, plus what I've always called the top socket, even though most bushcrafters nowadays call it a bearing block. Using the bow drill is a very simple and intuitive technique, with the cord wrapped once around the spindle, which is stabilized by the top socket. Rotation is achieved via the back and forth sawing motion of the bow. And here's a tool that I made from scratch. I call it an Indian pump drill. I think that's what they're called. But it consists of a post, a center post, or a spindle, I guess I should call it, and a pump board or a handle, and a flywheel. And then here, this was my own idea. I made a bit out of a flat file, and then I secured it here with a lot of cordon glue. Here I made a removable chuck, so you could pop this out, put a different tip in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to test out this deal, and right about there we'll try to bore us a hole. So get this balanced about right. So here's a little bit better angle showing how this thing works, this pump drill. And we'll just get her wound up here and give it a go. And it does drill a hole such as it is. Here's one of these pump drills that my dad made years ago. Overall, it's smaller than the one that I made, but it's got, for the size of it, it's got a larger flywheel. So it has more rotational inertia, I guess you could say. And it's got a smoother spin. One thing I especially like about the design of the pump drill my dad made is the way he squared off the spindle at the base where it fits into the flywheel, and then he filed a square hole in the flywheel that prevents it from slipping. And so I thought that was pretty neat. Admittedly, the pump drill is a fairly bulky item to store in a toolkit with its long spindle and flywheel, but it represents one possible method for boring holes and a simple device that could be created in a primitive or remote setting. With either the pump drill or the bow drill, I think it's important to note that the bit geometry will differ considerably from most other types of drilling systems that use twist bits, auger bits, or conventional spade bits, like the 3 bits we see on the left, that are designed to turn in only one direction. With the pump and bow drills, rotation repeatedly reverses, and the bit should be able to cut both ways. Well, that concludes this episode of Makeshift Madness. I want to thank you for watching, and until we get together again, stay creative.